mass extinctions that I really want to talk about. The first one is probably the most famous one, the one that took the dinosaurs 66.03 million years ago. What I need you to imagine is a meteorite the same size as Mount Everest, traveling 20 times the speed of a bullet. It slammed into Earth, vaporized all the water directly underneath it, and showered it with ash. The ensuing cataclysm basically wiped out 75% of all life in a very short amount of time. It's thought to be one of the most horrific losses of life in prehistory, but it's not the worst. The worst happened 252.6 million years ago, the Permian Triassic extinction event, and that killed off up to 95% of all life in the ocean. Now fast forward to 2019. What are we seeing? Over the last 200 years since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we've risen the water temperature by 1 whole degree. It's terrifying. You can't even fathom the extinction event that's on our doorsteps just by looking at these numbers alone. My greatest concern is that politicians will not listen to scientists at all. We're seeing this outright movement, and it's taking over every single country by storm, and it's going back into the 1950s. What we need to realize right now is that we're not in the 1950s. We're in 2018. We need to start acting and listening to scientists. These are the people that have devoted their entire lives to understanding the oceans, to understanding the planets. And if we don't listen to them, we're going to reach a point of no return. And that's going to be terrifying.
We, 7.5 billion humans today, have become so active that we are changing the climate at a very rapid rate. In fact, we are on the verge of the Earth's 6th great extinction event, but the first one driven by a biological species itself. We're also driving the climate toward a new, quite different state, one that is potentially hotter than anything we've seen over the last 50 or 60 million years. The important basic concept here is that the Earth system is a complex system that exists in well-defined states with a threshold between them. So we talk about the pathways the Earth system could take, and the one that we're currently on, the one in which humans are pushing the Earth system. Basically, we're doing two big things. We're changing the energy balance of the Earth system by pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that is causing the Earth to heat up. But at the same time, we are simplifying, changing, degrading the biosphere. These two are actually coupled to form one pathway for the Earth system. The reason they are coupled is that the biosphere actually is a very important source of carbon, pulling it down from the atmosphere. Think of the Amazon basin, think of the big forests in the northern hemisphere. Think of the phytoplankton in the ocean, the little plants in the surface ocean which pull down enormous amounts of carbon. They help to balance the Earth and keep it stable. But we humans are not only pushing a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're eroding the ability of the biosphere to pull that back down and stabilize the Earth. At the moment, the Earth still pulls down half of our emissions, but that capacity is weakening, so we are pushing the Earth toward a tipping point. Once we cross that threshold and decide we don't like the way the Earth is going, there's nothing we can do about it. The intrinsic feedbacks will push the Earth system to a very much hotter state. We call this hothouse Earth. So what happens when we cross that threshold? These processes, these parts of the biosphere that are taking up carbon are going to flip, and they're going to start pushing more carbon back up to the atmosphere, which warms it even further. And at the same time, ice is going to be retreating. What does that do? It reflects less and less of the sunlight, and it uncovers more darker ocean, darker land that absorbs more sunlight rather than reflecting it, and that warms the Earth further. Once we cross that, we're going to go to hothouse Earth, 4 or 5 degrees warmer, and it will support a much lower human population. What about the time frame? we could hit that threshold as early as mid-century. Now that is only about 3 decades away, but the critical point is we humans have to make the decisions now to avoid the possibility of that threshold, because it's going to take us a couple of decades to change our economic systems, to change our technologies. So the crunch time really is now. It's not 2030. In fact, it's probably not 2025. In the next electoral cycle or so around the world, we have to decide, we have to change direction. A friend and good colleague of mine named Carlos Nobre, who's an expert on the Amazon forest, which has its own tipping point, made a very important comment when people said, well, we can keep deforesting because we don't know where the tipping point lies. Carlos said, about the dumbest thing you can do is find out exactly where the tipping point lies by tipping it. And that's the same thing we should think about in terms of our Earth system as a whole. This estimate that this planetary threshold, this estimate that it could lie as low as 1.5 degrees, but will almost surely hit it by 3 degrees, means that the Paris Agreement actually sits within that range. The Paris Agreement is to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5. That is actually a very sensible statement. It doesn't say 2 degrees, it says well below 2 degrees. Now, I think at the time, the framing of that didn't take into account our current understanding of Earth as a complex system with a planetary threshold and a risk of hothouse Earth. But in fact, that target makes some sense, because if we keep temperature to well below 2 and get close to 1.5, we reduce the risk that we're going to cross that planetary threshold. I get asked the question, what can I do to tackle climate change, very frequently. And often the questioner is thinking about him or herself, what can I do individually? And there's a lot you can do. The answer I always give is, you can get active politically. This is a collective action problem. This isn't an individual behavior problem. We need to change a system. We need to change an economic system, and we need to change a political system. Fortunately, at least in our part of the world here in Australia, and in many of the OECD countries, we have democratic systems. We have a voice, we have elections. We have one coming up here in Australia, well, at least within the next year. And we can do something about climate change, because there are differences in how different parties, different politicians, how they approach the problem. So the most important thing we can do is become active, talk to our friends, talk to our neighbors, get involved, and help change the system.
Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! So rampages through our world. The gloomy face of the earth stares at us. We need to apologize.
Well, I decided to stand up and go to the strike because I was hearing about all of the bushfires and the droughts and all of these coal mines that were using fossil fuels for energy, and how much of an impact those companies had on our environment. Like Indy, I'm worried about our future and our generation and everybody else's generation. We're all kind of moving away from the big issue in our world, and we're not noticing what's happening, and I feel very concerned about that.
The evidence is in. Our timeline, exceedingly short, and our climate future, it's catastrophic. My generation of scientists will be the generation to deal with the environmental legacy dealt us by the hands of complacency, incompetence and exploitation. And we will do this. Alongside our League of Environmental Caretakers, our farmers, Indigenous nations, tour operators, fishermen, school students, activists, politicians, business owners, journalists, charities, philanthropists, filmmakers, and our caring local communities. Because climate change is not a belief, nor is it a philosophy. Climate change is science. Science derived from millions of dedicated hours by thousands of highly qualified researchers, students, doctors, and professors. Scientists working with NASA. Scientists consulting to the crowd-funded Climate Council Australia. And scientists and diplomats engaged with the United Nations Environmental Programme. And look, the list, it goes on. The planet is the hottest that it's been for at least 100,000 years. Atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented for at least 800,000 years. And this is unequivocally due to humans burning fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and gas can only be considered cheap energy because we haven't paid for the cleanup yet. So let's get behind our climate scientists. Let's get behind our politicians who want to make change happen as you continue to do your great work in supporting sustainable energy practices.
Adani keep going, then we won't be able to go to the barrier reef and see the coral, and which is something I would really like to do one day.
Yeah.